The recognition of madness, or mutually assured destruction, begins at White Sands in New Mexico when the Trinity test resulted in the detonation of the first nuclear bomb on July 16, 1945. It was only a few months later that Harry Truman made the decision to drop the bombs nicknamed Little Boy and Fat Man on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While this brought about VJ Day and ended World War II, it also introduced to the world an era where citizens and governments had to live in fear of entire cities being completely annihilated in an instant, a fear that manifested itself in the Cold War and almost became realized during 13 days in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a landmark event that began to answer many important questions about weapons of mass destruction that are still being addressed today. Do all governments have the right to possess nuclear weapons, and what new responsibilities do these weapons add to a government's domestic and foreign policy? After World War II, the Earth quickly shifted into shades of blue and red. Communism and capitalism were each attempting to spread their own spheres of influence to other third world countries while containing the other ideology. Fidel Castro launched his revolution to overthrow the Cuban regime and replace it with a communist state in 1953. When Castro ultimately succeeded in 1959, the United States was on edge because a country a mere 90 miles away was a cohort of the Soviets. This resulted in a proposal by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to invade Cuba as a viable option to keep Soviet missiles off the island. In the end, the United States launched a disastrous counter-revolution, the Bay of Pigs. Tensions between Cuba and the US had escalated since the Platt Amendment at the end of the Spanish-American War, which made Cuba a military protectorate of America without Cuban consent, but they were dramatically exacerbated by such a blatant attack on the autonomy of Cuba. As a result of such tensions, when Nikita Khrushchev suggested a deal to place Soviet warheads in Cuba in response to American missiles in Turkey, Castro was all ears. In August of 1962, the Russians began constructing missile sites, and by September the first dismantled nuclear missiles were shipped into Cuba. U-2 spy planes conducting reconnaissance work photographed these sites on October 14th, and 2 days later they landed on President Kennedy's desk, beginning a 13-day gauntlet where both sides played high-stakes poker with the fate of the world on the line. For the first few days, Kennedy attempted a guise of normality, even leaving for a brief campaign trip. Kennedy and his advisors had three options: ignore the missiles, adopt a naval quarantine against Cuba, or follow up the intelligence with a military strike on Cuba. Kennedy opted for the quarantine, and on October 22nd addressed the citizens of the United States and informed them of the situation and the government's response.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
While Soviet freighters that were still on the water decided to turn back, and the United States loosened its stranglehold of Cuban waters, letting an oil tanker through the line, there were still operational missiles in Cuba, and in the UN halls, Soviet and American diplomats exchanged shouting matches and accusations.
There is no experience like gazing down the nuclear gun barrel at the other side and realizing that everything you stand for and have dreamed of and have hoped for could be blown up.
In 2 days, Khrushchev hardened his original deal to the United States, making America pledge not only not to invade Cuba and remove the naval quarantine, but also to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which was relatively close to the Soviet Union. Kennedy and Khrushchev warily exchanged pledges, and the world took a step back from the precipice of total destruction. However, the crisis was not done affecting modern politics and warfare, as it provided a precedent for governmental responsibility in handling weapons of mass destruction. Kennedy and Khrushchev narrowly avoided a nuclear war that could only have ended in a catastrophic loss of human life. The evasion of this apocalyptic scenario permanently altered the way in which governments uphold their responsibility of providing national defense, while also changing the government's role in safeguarding information from the public. With nuclear weaponry threatening the security of entire countries, the US and the USSR had to be extremely cautious in their actions towards each other. In addition, the two superpowers were responsible for dealing with a whole new type of classified information, because the threat of an imminent nuclear holocaust had the potential to spark a nationwide panic. Khrushchev and Kennedy were the first leaders to encounter a nuclear standoff, and their ability to compromise showed that not only was compromise an option, it was the only option. Major global powers were now prevented from open and direct confrontations without risking the annihilation of their people. At the time, however, advisors to both Kennedy and Khrushchev urged war. In the US, an airstrike to knock out the Russian missile bases in Cuba was proposed, but Kennedy rejected the plan on the grounds that it could instigate a nuclear retaliation by the Soviets. Meanwhile, in Russia, people were whispering about Khrushchev's supposed softness towards the West, and many of Khrushchev's counselors thought stern actions were necessary to repair his image. At issue were not just the lives of hundreds of millions of people, but also government transparency. What responsibility does the government have to keep its people informed of developments that pose an immediate threat to the security of an entire nation? Kennedy waited until he had decided on a course of action before announcing the situation to his citizens, while Khrushchev kept his people in the dark on the major details. Citizens of the US and Cuba were terrified and carried out regular drills in preparation for a nuclear war. However, according to Khrushchev's son Sergei, the Soviet Union reacted very differently. The citizens had information on a limited basis, given the centralized control of the media. Nevertheless, the responsibility the governments felt was intensified, as they shouldered the burden of protecting millions of lives. Everyone waited in fear, hoping that nobody fired first. Soldiers from both sides on the high seas waited, as they had instructions to engage the enemy in a moment's notice if they were attacked. The Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the most well-known and dangerous situations involving nuclear weapons to date, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev were true to their responsibilities as leaders of major world powers by showing a willingness to compromise at a time when nuclear annihilation was a real possibility. The crisis also introduced a question that is still being addressed today. Do all countries have a right to possess weapons of mass destruction? The US and Russia both dealt with this problem relatively close to their borders, with Russia's fear of American missiles in Turkey and Italy, while the US was afraid of Soviet technology in Cuba. Neither the Americans nor the Soviets approved of the threat posed by having nuclear weapons so close to their own countries. What the US and the USSR had in common was the view that nuclear weapons posed a threat too great to be left unrestricted. This opinion came from the fear that less stable countries did not have the right to be trusted with something so dangerous and potentially devastating. This is a modern-day conflict with nations like Iran and North Korea. While many nations defend nuclear arsenals as a means to consolidate their sovereignty and see non-proliferation treaties as an attempt by the established nuclear club to protect its own monopoly on nuclear weapons, they have become suspect to international scrutiny over whether or not they have the political stability and dependable leadership to possess nuclear weapons. The argument that arose from the Cuban Missile Crisis encompasses the boundary between national defense and international aggression, a topic that is still very relevant in modern-day politics. Countries have the right and responsibility to protect their boundaries, but at what point does their right to national defense infringe upon the security of another country? For scenarios like this, global leaders look to the precedent set by the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US and USSR had greater perceived control over their counterparts, with their own missiles monitoring the other superpower, but their ability to relinquish that false sense of security was a crucial step toward greater protection for everyone involved. It was clear that regulation was needed, and after the crisis, the SALT treaties and the revamping of the IAEA, established in 1957, defined how this great and terrible weapon should be controlled. During the crisis, the most powerful countries at the time decided the fate of nuclear weapons in other countries that did not have the same global influence. The US, Russia, UK, France, and China lead global possession of nuclear weapons, while also owning the permanent seats on the UN Security Council. The Cuban Missile Crisis established governmental rights and responsibilities in relation to the new and deadly atomic warhead for future generations, providing an example of restraint in what could have been a nuclear annihilation. While cool-headedness from both Kennedy and Khrushchev prevailed and the compromises that ultimately ended the conflict were forged, the world was confronted with the harsh reality of nuclear warfare. The Cuban Missile Crisis ushered in a new era of world history. Nuclear weapons, with the awesome destructive power they give to whoever wields them, represent globalization and the increased interconnectedness of the formerly disjointed human civilization. We live in an era where the touch of a button could obliterate a foreign metropolis, or an external conflict result in radioactive collateral damage. But this is coupled with the unprecedented level to which the human species can now collaborate in the creation of increasingly wondrous achievements. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a reminder of our collective responsibility to support one another if we wish to avoid madness and thrive in this new world we have created.